Hey all, here are OS Reviews. Today we're taking a revisited look at the Oppo Reno 10x. This is a very distinctive smartphone from Oppo, which is rather unconventional since this brand has a bit of a reputation of being more conservative typically with their designs, and sometimes the pricing on their phones don't necessarily correlate with the specs that you're getting. In other words, they tend to be a little on the pricey side because this is a brand that started off making hi-fi equipment, positioned more as a luxury or designer-like brand rather than getting the best specs on paper, which tech enthusiasts typically want to see. However, many of those stereotypes are broken with the Oppo Reno 10x. This was also towards the start of the Reno line, which continues to persist to this day and is more of their camera-centric series. But unfortunately, some of the atypical charm has been kind of lost along the way. For example, the latest gen Oppo Reno 10, notably not the 10X, which was launched here during the summer, has a conventional design that is really not that different from other smartphone companies, including Samsung, Huawei, and Xiaomi. But the original Reno and the Reno 10X here really did try to push the boundaries. For instance, there is this really unique shark fin pop-up selfie camera on the very top there, which increases the screen-to-body ratio of the display on the front by minimizing the bezels needed, since there is no physical hole punch or teardrop notch on the front of the phone. And although it's not the first time that a motorized pop-up camera has been designed on a smartphone, for instance, their sister brand OnePlus also used it on the 7 Pro, I have to say that the shark fin form factor just peaks up a little bit more in a subtle way at the very top there, just seems a little bit more elegant from a design perspective, not to mention that the 10X name is derived from having a Periscope zoom lens system available on the rear. So this is actually a 5x telephoto optical zoom lens, but when combined with digital gets you up to 10 times magnification. So this is also, for its time, one of the most advanced zoom systems you could find on an Android smartphone. One other very elegant design trait was what they call the O-ring on the rear. And this really subtle detail is here because Oppo claims it will prevent the back of your phone, including the lens, from scratching when you set it down onto a table. This will be the point that comes into contact. Just really thoughtful, not to mention that the entire back of this phone is completely flat. There is no camera humps of any kind, despite the, again, 10 times zoom system integrated on here. So this is such a clean, symmetrical look, which we pretty much never see these days, with camera systems and modules getting just larger and larger. And that's not even mentioning other tasteful details, including a accented green power key that matches the color of the O-ring on the rear, plus the slightly dimpled and flattened edges on the top and the bottom of the aluminum rails that give it just a little bit more character. And best of all, the Oppo Reno and Reno 10X weren't even considered that much more expensive compared to other flagships for their time either, which was a pretty big departure from Oppo's usual pricing strategy. So it was really a breath of fresh air. Now, there were a couple of problems though. The most obvious one being that the Reno and Reno 10X were never really available globally outside of China and markets in Asia. So in the US, it was incredibly difficult to get your hands on one of these phones unless you import it, which typically required a higher cost. And also, the aforementioned sister company OnePlus, which are owned by the same corporation, is available to purchase globally, including in the US, and the OnePlus 7 Pro that I talked about is part of the exact same generation phone released in 2019 with pretty similar specs, including the same Snapdragon 855 processor, as well as a similar footprint with nearly a 6.7-inch OLED display as well. So in contrast, the 7 Pro had a cleaner software experience. Instead of ColorOS, it was OxygenOS. And although in this case, the 7 Pro's design is not quite as delicate in my opinion, there is no O-ring, there's actually a hump on the back of the device where the camera module protrudes. However, the main advantage here is it has a better display. It's a sharper 2K resolution compared to Full HD, and also it's a faster 90 Hz refresh rate, which makes animations feel even smoother. But on the other hand, this is a flat panel, so there is no curves on the edges, which I actually slightly prefer from a practicality perspective. When you're holding the phone, there's less chance of accidental triggers. It's coupled with up to 12 gigabytes of RAM, with up to 256 gigabytes of storage on the top of the line model, which is further expandable by a micro SD card slot that serves as the hybrid dual SIM tray. Now, speaking of the camera system here, the other lenses constitute of a primary 48 megapixel main lens with optical image stabilization. By the way, the 5x optical zoom lens is 13 megapixels with, again, 10 times hybrid zoom, and also has OIS on board, so it mitigates some of the shakiness as you're taking photos. And there is also an 8 megapixel ultra wide angle lens as well. One thing I will say though is the LED flash is actually hidden in the pop-up selfie system. There is a pretty spacious 4065 milliamp hour capacity battery, which suffices for about a day and a half's use. Now this phone does have stereo speakers as well, so one at the bottom, and then the earpiece serves as the second one to give you some better separation, although unfortunately there is no Qi wireless charging available on this model. Other connectivity options are quite typical for a flagship, including NFC, GPS, Wi-Fi are all built on in, but for a phone that has a motorized part, it doesn't have official IP rating, but also kind of expected. Last but not least, I'll also mention that this phone came in a variety of brilliant looking colors, including this kind of aura blue, but there's also a pink version, more of this gradient finish version, as well as a more conventional black tone could all be picked between. Now, software-wise, we're talking about ColorOS. It came originally with Android 9 Pie, but was later upgraded up to Android 11. So not the newest, but at least there is still no content that you aren't able to install. So depending on the ROM that you're looking at, you will still find Google services available compared to, say, Huawei devices. So that at least doesn't become too problematic. Overall, though, the UI styling of ColorOS, I would say, is kind of love or hate. Personally, I would put it into a similar category as MIUI, which is to say it's a little bit more derived by iOS in terms of how the icons are styled, and also having unlimited pages to customize with additional applications that you're installing. It's a little bit more on the playful and cartoonish side of things, but overall it still is a consistent enough look. It's just I do prefer OxygenOS on OnePlus devices when it comes to the elegance and simplicity as compared to ColorOS in many cases, but definitely not bad, and the UI has gotten better progressively in recent updates. Ultimately, there's nothing wrong with ColorOS. Everything in terms of customization of wallpapers to, again, transition effects can be pretty easily handled on their devices. It's quite polished, but again, it's just a different look compared to stock Android. Now, what we will find on here, though, would be a handful of utility tools created by Oppo from the ground up, including their versions of the clock app, plus some of the other utility tools like a built-in voice recorder is handy to have since some of these services are not baked directly into stock Android anymore. They also have their own version of a calculator app, which you can also use to convert currency, as well as toggle into some other modes here on the side for things like pressure, other units. Other additions include Oppo's own file manager, which does have a universal dark theme and does actually look quite good, even though it is quite on the colorful side of things with the accents. And by the way, the haptic vibration engine is also done incredibly well on the Reno 10x. It's super tight and satisfying whenever you're interacting with elements, and it all runs really smoothly as well. So there is really no lag to speak of, despite this being a standard 60 Hz panel. But again, the processor and the sufficient RAM still keeps things loading at a very responsive speed. And deeper customization options available in ColorOS include the always-on display mode. Again, this phone does have an under-display fingerprint scanner since it is an OLED screen for biometrics, as well as changing the way icon packs are displayed can also be fully adjusted on here as well, so you can access material style, more of a pebble style, including the ability to toggle on and off the app tray, which is again found in stock Android, but a lot of Chinese OEM ROMs tend to disable it by default. Interestingly, similar to Samsung, Oppo has also implemented a side panel that they call Quick Launch on their phones now as well, which also gives you the flexibility of quickly multitasking by, say, running it on the top screen and something else here on the bottom. In fact, you can even treat these as small floating windows or kind of mini widgets, kind of like if you're using a tablet. In fact, you can float this around and do something while you access other apps in the background if you prefer. And there are even some fun pop-up selfie effects that you can play around with, which uses a little bit of sound as well as an animation there as you are rising the camera up and down. For example, this one called Technology. And similar to some devices from Umidigi, it looks like Oppo is also allowing virtual RAM expansion available on their current ColorOS version as well. So this will use up some of the ROM or storage and use it as virtual RAM to further increase a little bit of multitasking capability. It's not exactly the same as having real RAM, but can still be helpful if you're in a pinch. And again, this phone has been upgraded all the way up to Android 12 through ColorOS, which is still pretty recent, I have to say, for a phone that was from 2019. So it shows pretty good commitment from Oppo's part, at least. They are one of the larger smartphone manufacturers internationally these days, so software support at least doesn't seem to be too problematic. Now if we jump into the camera UI next, it's also pretty simple, but it can quickly toggle through some of the zoom profiles, including 5x zoom and then 10x hybrid zoom, as well as the ultra wide angle lens as well there just at a click, or you can also pinch in and out instead if you prefer. There's also a beauty mode that can be turned on, and down below here you can toggle through effects including night mode, increasing the exposure time to make things more brightly lit. Video can be captured up to 4K 30 FPS. You can also use portrait aka bokeh mode here on the side, and under more options you can find a barcode and QR code scanner similar to Google Lens, and there's also a Pro mode that will allow you to customize aspects including the ISO, white balance, and shutter speed yourself for more granularity. Revisiting some of the results here on the Reno 10X, I would say it's mostly satisfactory and perhaps a slight edge above the 7 Pro by contrast. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the best camera that I've ever seen on a smartphone, but for its age, it is doing a reasonably good job. This shows an example of the 10x zoom in action. You can see some of the clouds there in the background and what that looks like once I'm zoomed all the way in. So it is quite versatile to have this zoom capability available, even though in this day and age we now have even higher magnification amounts available on some Samsung flagships. But again, from 2019, this is already showing you a taste of the best of the best. Now you can also see that colors do tend to be a little bit more on the oversaturated side of things in general, as compared to maybe OnePlus devices tend to be a little bit more neutral, but nonetheless it gives it a more kind of Samsung-like aesthetic, I would say, and it's definitely not bad. Some folks will like it. It brings more energy and life to these photos, and even now can still be quite attractive as you're sharing them onto social media, especially with that primary lens at over 48 megapixels, a lot of fine details that you can further crop into. This is a great example where the HDR is also doing a good job. Even though this is a pretty challenging condition with sunlight in the background, it's not blowing out too many of those colors and still looks very pleasing. So generally speaking, this is still a very competent camera in terms of performance. Again, don't expect it to beat the latest iPhone or Pixel, but it still is more than good enough. Now here's a quick demo of the video playback and speaker quality next. Some takeaways include that it does sound actually quite decent, I would say. You do get some stereo separation, but in this instance, I would say the earpiece is definitely on the softer side in terms of volume output, so it's not quite as balanced, but still better than not having it present, I would say. The bottom at the very least is quite loud and sounds good enough. There is Dolby Atmos software support as well that you can use to further crank up some of that surround sound mode when you're watching videos. And Oppo also has their O1 Ultra Vision Engine mode available, which essentially is upscaling standard videos up to HDR to add even more contrast and vibrancy to some of your videos that you're consuming on YouTube, Netflix, and the like. Especially with this large display that is, again, uninterrupted, it remains a pretty comfortable experience for media consumption. And scrubbing between parts of the video doesn't prove to be problematic at all. It still is very fast, as you can tell there, which is something that we've seen time and time again through some of our recent Snapdragon 855 device revisited videos. So good to find that here. It still is handling itself quite well when it comes to general performance, and reception quality, again using dual band Wi-Fi, is also quite fast, but things are still loading along here almost instantly whenever you're tapping on those sites. So again, goes to show that the 855 processor really was ahead of its time, and even now I think it's still an excellent performer. And when it comes to doing a bit of gaming is concerned, it should come as no surprise that the 855 is still extremely competent when it comes to the majority of titles, including even heavier ones like PUBG and Asphalt can still be played without really any problems at all. I would say thermals, again, on this chip is not too problematic. You don't have too many instances of overheating, so even slightly longer sessions can still be mostly enjoyed. Also, as you're playing certain games, you can access a tray on the side of the phone to see how much RAM is available. You can begin to record video as well as increase the screen brightness, optimize on the system performance. So that is more or less it as far as our revisited look back at the Oppo Reno 10X. I have to admit that looking back, this was definitely an excellently designed smartphone. The memorable shark fin pop-up selfie system, as well as still very smooth performance to this day, still makes this one of my favorite Oppo smartphones. And like many other folks, I am optimistic that Oppo can once again create more devices that are super memorable and unique in the future, rather than merely playing it safe. And that definitely shows, and as an enthusiast, this is a phone that again just stands out when looking back. So nonetheless, a pretty interesting device. You can check out this as well as other Oppo devices if interested, and the links down below. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the Oppo Reno 10X Revisited.